and welcome to this SCVO hosted webinar. My name is Steve Grosier and I am the lead researcher on this project from SCVO's side. Thank you for joining us today to learn a bit more about what the first wave of the findings from the Scottish Third Sector Tracker are telling us about the health of Scotland's third sector organisations. I don't want to steal too much of the researchers that have joined us today thunder, but I will just make some brief introductions and give a little bit of background information to the project before we launch into the findings. I am delighted to say that we have Alex Belcher and Jenna Allen with us today from DJS Research, and they are the independent research company that SCVO and partners have appointed to carry out this research on our behalf. The Scottish Third Sector Tracker is I think a really unique and interesting project to be a part of. It is, as far as I'm aware, the first of its kind in Scotland, and it is a panel of third sector organisations who provide us with data and information in a quarterly survey so that we can better understand the sort of health, identify any trends and understand the challenges that third sector organisations in Scotland are facing. This is obviously important for a number of reasons, but it helps policymakers and decision makers and organisations like SCVO and the Scottish Government to better understand the challenges the sector is facing and how we best support them through those challenges. As you'll see when Alex starts the presentation, it covers a broad range of topics from financial health, the workforce and volunteers that the sector works with and uses, and also some questions about service delivery and the programs that the organisation provides to beneficiaries. There will be the opportunity for a Q&A at the end of the session once Alex has presented, but I think for the time being I'll hand over to Alex Belcher, who has a few slides, and he will present the key findings from the first wave. So Alex, delighted to have you along, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. As Steve mentioned, I'm Alex from DJS Research. We've been delighted to be involved in this project for SCVO and its partners to take a look into how the third sector in Scotland is emerging from the pandemic and the challenges that have been implicit within getting the sector this far. I'm going to quickly share my screen. I'm going to talk you through just some of the findings from the baseline wave of this survey, which is the only wave to have been conducted so far. It's just to give you an overview of kind of how we've conducted this survey. It's a longitudinal survey that's going to follow a sort of a single cohort of Scottish third sector organisations from summer 2021 through to the end of 2022. And I'm sure we've got some of those organisations who have been involved in that on the line today. The survey is going to be repeated every quarter with a little bit of variation each time to react to some of the developments in the sector to make sure that we're capturing data that is relevant all the way through. The first wave was predominantly conducted over the telephone, but all of the remaining waves are going to be conducted online to make it a little bit more convenient for the organisation to participating. To give a bit of context, that first wave, we had 560 of around 560 of our 585 respondents taking part over the telephone. From now on, it'll be all online. And the data sample that we've now collated from that first wave, we've got quotas and weighting in place to make sure that the cohort that we're looking at fairly well represents the wider third sector in Scotland against sort of a few key firmographics. So we're pretty confident what we're looking at is a kind of a good representation of the third sector within these findings. As I mentioned, this is a baseline survey, and what that means is that we're kind of establishing a snapshot of the situation in summer 2021, which is when it was conducted between July and the end of August. So we got this snapshot of the situation in the summer. We can now use that to track the stories of all 585 organisations across the next year and a half. What we've done in the baseline is ask people to consider how their current situation as of the summer compares to their expectations and experiences from before the pandemic, to try and get an idea of sort of a fairly robust idea of how the pandemic has changed their fortunes over that 12 to 15 months since March 2020. This gives us a kind of a fairly solid sort of foundation on which to build the following tracking, where we can see where organisations go from here, what are those trends, and kind of what direction is the sector heading. So in some ways, the interesting story will start to come kind of later in the process as we start to see what trends and different groups, different fortunes develop over the coming months. But we still have a fairly interesting kind of snapshot of the third sector as it is starting to look to kind of move on from the pandemic. The full data set allows us to, us, SCVO and its partners, to analyse the findings in more granular detail, say by size, region, type of activity. However, this short summary will just be looking at a small section of the questions that were asked, and we're looking at the whole of market figures only. The data set will be there and accessible to organisations, and certainly a lot more detail, kind of a more detailed view will be kind of looked at. So to start looking at some of the findings, one second. The first thing that was really striking from the results that came back was the extent to which it showed the sheer extent of the impact of the pandemic on the sector. I don't think it will come as a surprise to many people on the line, but certainly the results kind of really kind of quantified how universal that impact was. Essentially, no organisation was left free from some kind of challenge implicit in navigating through the pandemic for the sector. So we can see that around 9 in 10 organisations reported some kind of disruption to their service delivery over the course of the pandemic up until summer this year. If we drill down into that a little bit more, we can see that that was mainly driven by the restrictions and impact in place around social distancing and the initial lockdowns, which were preventing organisations from doing the work that they needed to do. We also had approximately half who reported financial issues as well, which is obviously a substantial cohort within the third sector. To compound the impact of these challenges to service delivery, we also saw that most third sector organisations actually saw an increase in demand for their services over the pandemic. So not only is their ability to deliver on their services disrupted, they're also seeing kind of more demand for their services on the other side. But despite that conflict, the sector has kind of really stepped up. We've seen almost 3/4 of those who said that their demand for their services had increased, still able to find ways to kind of meet most or all of that demand. So we see a sector that is encumbered in terms of the way that they can deliver, is seeing this increase demand, but also is finding ways to make sure that that demand is met, at least kind of in the main, if not entirely. For those organisations who provided services directly to individuals and communities, we did a little bit of digging into kind of what sort of impact we'd seen the pandemic have upon their service users. And it threw up some sort of fairly shocking figures relating to the sort of the hardship brought upon service users across this time. And you can see here three of the key elements, which was deterioration in mental health and well-being. 90% of organisations reported seeing that amongst some of their service user base. Just under 3/4 seeing issues regarding physical health as a result of the pandemic, and a similar amount seeing financial hardship. So we're seeing a sector that is very much in touch with the way in which the pandemic has affected the communities that they serve. Now, from an organisational perspective, we can see that furlough was well used by the third sector in Scotland, with approximately 3 in 10 having used that across the period from March 2020 through to the summer this year. It's quite hard to find robust statistics to compare this to, but from what I've seen, it looks as if the overall figure for the UK in terms of all businesses using furlough is kind of roughly in line with this figure, depending on which sort of source you go to, but somewhere between 25 and 30%. So it's certainly a sector that is making use of or had made use of furlough across this time. And what we see is about 1 in 10 in the summer was still using furlough. What we're going to do is track this until this current wave that will be run in the next couple of weeks, just as we sort of cap furlough off, just to see how that sort of denouement from furlough is kind of being used by organisations. Unfortunately, we see 1 in 10 organisations having made redundancies across the course of the pandemic. What we don't have is a baseline figure to compare that for pre-pandemic expectations, but what we will be doing is using the tracker aspect, the longitudinal aspect, to see how in the recovery from the pandemic we see the rates of redundancy sort of continue to develop over the coming year and a half. As we might expect, with so many organisations seeing their service delivery restricted, almost a third of organisations had reduced the number of volunteers that they worked with in the 15 months since March 2020. And if we sort of delve into the more detailed data set, what we can see is around 1/4 of organisations had seen a decrease of up to half of their pre-pandemic volunteer force, and then 1 in 10 saw a decrease of more than half. So that's they constitute the most sort of severe decline in volunteer usage. taking a look at the financial situation, it's clear that financially the pandemic was hard on the sector. Half of all organisations in the sector reported decreased income over the course of the pandemic, which most of those who had seen a decrease predicted would continue at least into winter 2021. And actually 1 in 5 felt that the reduced income would last at least another year, so at least until summer 22. So that's a fairly substantial kind of recovery time there. 1 in 5 organisations saw their income reduced to half or even kind of worse compared to the pre-pandemic level. So it's a sizable minority of organisations who have seen a substantial reduction of their income over the course of the pandemic. Just keeping with that audience who had experienced a decrease in turnover over the course of the pandemic, the most commonly cited reasons for that decrease in turnover were firstly reduced trading income, and secondly reduced fundraising revenues, lying at the heart of that kind of overall decrease in their turnover. Of particular concern was the fact that almost 2/3 of organisations, 61%, who reported that they held less than 6 months financial reserves at the time of their interview, despite the fact that amongst that 61%, 59%, a strong majority of those organisations felt that those reserves were very important or essential to their future survival. So we're seeing a sector in which not only are a lot of organisations sitting on kind of a reduced financial reserves, it's one that believes that those reserves are sort of integral to their future survival. However, despite that, the sector as a whole was confident about its future survival. 3/4 of organisations were very confident that they would still be operating in a year's time, 75%. And only 3% said that they were either kind of not very confident or not at all confident. However, I think it should be said that we certainly recognise that the loss of any third sector organisations is certainly a loss for the sector, and particularly to the individuals and the communities that they serve. And just a final look at some data, just kind of on looking at the ability of the sector to kind of react to the challenges that we've seen, and also giving us a glimpse of kind of how well set up organisations are to thrive in the future. We can see that despite the harsh reality of the situation in which the pandemic has put a lot of Scotland's third sector organisations, there are clear signs that the sector has innovated and adapted to find its way through. So on your screen, you can see 3 of the most common ways in which organisations have adapted their approach to address financial pressures. So 57% having applied for new funding sources, just under half having made use of their financial reserves, and more than 1/3 having developed new funding streams. And elsewhere, we see on a sort of operational level that 8 in 10 organisations have adapted to provide more of their support online. A similar number have sort of assumed the role of sharing key information about the pandemic to service users and peers, and 1 in 7 have started offering entirely new services to people in response to the pandemic. So it's clear that we're we're seeing a sector that's very hard hit. However, a sector that is very resourceful, is very malleable and flexible, and has been sort of actively finding new ways to deliver on sort of social causes that it supports, kind of in new ways, despite these hardships. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is just the beginning for the Scottish Third Sector Tracker. What we've been able to review is the baseline results from the summer. I think that they're quite interesting. There's a lot more there than we've just sort of skimmed across to give you a sort of a rough idea of the type of data and the situation that we've been reviewing. However, its real value is going to show as we continue to follow our members' journeys across the next sort of 15 to 18 months, and see how they respond through the end of the pandemic and hopefully beyond. All of our members will have received a slightly more detailed information pack by email. If you're on the line, you are a member and you've not received that, just let me know. The findings are also available, or will be available sort of shortly on the DJS website. So if you go on to djsresearch.co.uk, you'll be able to navigate to our published reports, and the baseline findings will be there. So that's kind of concludes the run through of that baseline data. I'll sort of hand back to Steve, but I'll stick around just in case you've got any questions about what you've heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. I thought that was a fascinating look at the findings from, certainly some of the findings from the first wave. And as Alex mentioned, all of the outputs, including the slides, a more detailed infographic, the reports and the data tables will all be made available on SCVO's website in the coming days. So if you are interested, for example, in a particular geographical area, or if you work in a social enterprise and you want to know specifically how social enterprises responded to this survey, then that will all be there for you to play around with and explore at your leisure. I should probably have mentioned at the start that if you do have any questions about anything that Alex has just presented, or around the methodology, or how you'd like to be involved, please just drop them in the chat and we will try and answer them the best we can here. And if we cannot, we will certainly come back to you once we've had a look at the data or explored what it is that you are looking for. As Alex mentioned, this is a longitudinal study, meaning that we will be starting the research for the second wave in the coming weeks. Likely, I think next week is what we are aiming for, and we are always looking for new panel members to join. So if you are an organisation that works in the third sector and you would like to be involved to share your experiences and challenges, then if you get in touch with myself or Alex, then we would love to have you included in the data and hear about your experiences. For the more people, the more organisations on the panel, then better we can understand how the sector as a whole is faring. So please do get in touch about that if you're interested. What else to say? I see we've got an interesting question here popped in the into the question. Thank you for sharing. And representation there has been from the CLD sector. Alex, I don't know if you know the answer to that off the top of your head. I certainly don't, but I can look into the data and see what it says.
I don't. It's not a data point that we specifically gathered. However, we do have a lot of information sort of background information about panelists from the process of kind of getting them on board that we could use to try and sort of understand. It might not be 100% accurate, but we certainly would be able to investigate that.
Thank you. If I can't see who you are, who's asked that question, but if you want to drop me an email, we can explore that further and make that available, that information available if we do have it. Alex just ran through the key findings from what was predominantly the closed questions in the survey. It's probably worth mentioning that we do have in each survey wave, we have asked a couple of open questions to get a better understanding of some of the more complex challenges, or something that we didn't feel we could simply answer, get a sufficient answer from a closed question. So in this first wave, we've asked organisations to tell us in detail about their challenges that they anticipate over the next little while, and what support organisations such as SCVO and Scottish Government and independent funders, for example, could provide those organisations to help them through those challenges. As I'm sure you can appreciate, with 585 responses to those questions, some of them very detailed, it's going to take us a little bit of time to analyse those and make sense of those. But our intention is to hopefully have looked at those two questions, and we will analyse those to understand what they're telling us, and we'll make those findings available hopefully before Christmas to sit alongside the other outputs that we've just discussed. And there will be opportunity to ask further open questions down the line, different open questions down the line as we move through, and we'll also be looking to analyse those and make them available to the sector, but also, I suppose, importantly, to policymakers and decision makers, so that they can target the resources that the sector needs most appropriately. Please do continue to pop some questions in the chat if you have them. Alex, I think from my point of view, one thing I found particularly interesting was that you were saying that this, as the baseline, is not necessarily the most interesting thing about the way that this study's been designed. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you think the approach that we're taking here is more valuable than a one-off snapshot survey, for example, and what we might anticipate seeing as we work our way through the next 5 survey waves.
Yeah. So I think what's going to be useful for SCVO and its partners is trying to understand the nuance of how different cohorts are being affected, have been affected, but also are kind of reacting throughout the process of emerging from the pandemic. And what the sort of three options that would have been available. We could have just taken a big snapshot and just left it at that, and tried to predict what kind of support the sector needs, purely from the responses of that one snapshot in the summer. I mean, it's perfectly doable, but it's not. What it doesn't give us is that kind of foresight and sort of and feedback. The other option would be to just do a series of snapshots over the coming months, which again would be useful because it allows you to measure potential impact from the measures that, say, the Scottish Government, SCVO, the support that's being bought. You can measure that. However, the benefit of the longitudinal side is that we follow individual stories. So we're interviewing the same respondents each and every wave, to see kind of how we can map individual organizations through this procedure. And what that allows us to do is kind of put them into subgroups, see what kind of individual trends exist within the sort of the emerging story, and allow you to say, okay, this particular sector, they were actually doing pretty well in the summer, but they've really tailed off as we go into 2022, or a particular sector that was struggling in the summer, actually they seem to have received the support they need. They're doing much better. They've stabilized, and that's the kind of story that you can pull out from this longitudinal approach. And that's why I sort of say the real interest of the story is going to come next wave, a couple of waves down the line, where we start to sort of be able to pull out, okay, this is how within the sector different areas are kind of responding and adapting.
Thank you, Alex. We've got a few more questions in the chat, and I'll pick up the ones that I can answer possibly, and I'll defer to you on some of the other points if that's okay. Cassie, thank you for your question, Cassie. Cassie has asked about whether this increased demand and the organisation's ability to broadly meet most of that increased demand throughout the pandemic, how sustainable that is for these organisations to keep providing such levels of support without perhaps the resources to do so over a longer period of time. I think that's a very good question, Cassie, and I'm not sure we have looked at the data in enough detail, the open questions, to get a sense of how we might answer that at this stage. I think from a quick glance or a quick scan of the open questions, there's a couple of key themes emerging, and those are around sort of around the sustainability of funding for the sector comes across as a key issue, which sort of, I guess, touches slightly upon your point there. And there is a lot of other talk around sort of the sustainability of staff, and by that I mean in terms of their own mental health and burnout, having worked so intensely throughout the pandemic. I can't really say more at this stage because we haven't analysed those questions, but those are things we'll be looking into doing once we have the resources to do that. So thank you for your question there. Another question here from Martin Crew. Thank you, Martin, for coming, and thank you for your question. So the makeup, Martin's asked if the sample has been mapped against the Oscar profile. The sample that we have is mapped against SCVO's sector stats, which use a lot of the Oscar data. So we have, as I think Alex said in his presentation, we have used the classifications and the geographical areas that the organisations are located in to build a panel that is as representative of the whole third sector, not just the charity sector, but the whole third sector as possible, with weightings applied to certainly some of the smaller categories to make them representative of the larger population. So it's as close to the whole of the third sector in terms of how representative it is on a geographical and field of work, if you like, as we can possibly make it. Having said that, the more organisations that we do have on the panel, then the better the representation is. So as I say, if there are organisations out there that would like to join, please do get in touch. We would certainly love to have you involved in the study. And hopefully that answers your question, Martin. And third question here from Ian Marilyn. Thank you for asking that. That's a very timely question to be asking, as that is just something that we have been discussing in that question around whether the relationship between statutory partners and third sector organisations is something we have just discussed, including as a question in the second wave of research, as we were seeing a lot of sort of anecdotal information or discussion about how this might have changed. And there's been a recent Audit Scotland report, which you may or may not have seen, looking at this issue. And so we're going to use the opportunity to ask this question in the second wave of the research, which I think, as Alex has alluded to, is another one of the benefits of having this panel study, this longitudinal panel study, is that we can pick up and ask questions that emerge from other research or anecdotal information that we're getting. It allows us to just probe a representative panel of organisations to ask those specific kinds of questions. So that will be a question included in the next wave, and we'll hopefully have some interesting and useful information back from that, as I believe, Alex, that's one of the open questions, I'm right in saying.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, it wasn't letting me unmute, just to say yes.
Thank you. Alex, just to say, just to check that the panel members have all received their infographic, and I think you said if they haven't already, to get in touch with yourself.
Absolutely.
Okay. Don't know if we've got any more questions. I'll just give it a moment while people digest what's been presented. But I don't want to keep people if there's nothing else at the moment, and you can always please do reach out to myself or Alex if anything comes to mind once you've had a chance to digest the information a bit more. And I will certainly keep everyone up to date when all of the findings go live on SCVO's website, and you can explore the data there. I know that Alex touched on thank yous in his presentation, but I would also like to extend my thanks to the funding partners, particularly Scottish Government, Third Sector Unit, Callum Irving and Kate Kilpatrick in particular have been a great support, not just financially, but also in the design of and analysis of the results. I'd like to also thank Nick Addington, the Chief Executive of the William Grant Foundation, for his generous contribution to the project and his inputs also. And finally, the National Lottery Community Fund and Jennifer Fleming as the representative on the project. So thank you very much. Without you, it would not be possible to be doing what I think is quite a valuable project. So yeah, thank you to our funders, and also thank you to DJS, Alex and Jenna, for running this project on our behalf. It's been pleasure so far working with you today, and I'm looking forward to the subsequent waves and what this project's going to tell us about the health of the third sector.
You're very welcome, and it's from our side, it's been wonderful to be involved and to see such a useful tool being sort of developed for the third sector.
Thank you, Alex. It looks as though we don't have any further questions at this stage, so I think we'll just wrap up the webinar there. And yeah, I'm always around if anyone wants to get in touch about any of this, and as is Alex at DGS. So thanks to thanks to everyone for joining, and thanks again to DGS for a really interesting presentation.